The spring rain pelted against the windshield of William Harrison's Bentley as he waited impatiently at the red light on Madison Avenue in New York City. The 60-year-old real estate magnate drummed his manicured fingers on the leather steering wheel, his mind preoccupied with the upcoming investors' meeting. Numbers, projections, and strategies consumed his thoughts, the familiar comfort zone he had retreated to since Eleanor's passing 6 years ago. As the windshield wipers swept across the glass, William's gaze drifted to the sidewalk. Through the streaks of rain, he spotted a disheveled woman huddled under the minimal shelter of a shop awning, with 3 small children clinging to her. Something about her posture, the way she held herself despite her circumstances, struck a chord of familiarity within him. The light turned green, but William didn't move forward. Cars honked behind him as he squinted through the downpour. The woman turned slightly, and her profile came into view. Recognition dawned on him like a bolt of lightning. "Sarah?" he whispered to himself, remembering the compassionate nurse who had cared for Eleanor during those final painful months. Sarah Taylor, the young woman whose gentle hands and kind words had brought comfort not just to his dying wife, but to him as well. Without thinking, William pulled his car to the curb, ignoring the blaring horns of frustrated drivers. He reached for his umbrella and stepped out into the rain, his Italian leather shoes splashing in puddles as he approached the huddled group. "Excuse me," he called out, his normally commanding voice softened by uncertainty. The woman turned, her face thin and weather-worn, but unmistakably the same Sarah who had once moved efficiently through the halls of New York Presbyterian, dispensing medication and compassion in equal measure. She didn't recognize him at first, her eyes wary and defensive as she pulled the children closer to her side. "Sarah Taylor, it's William Harrison, Eleanor's husband." Her eyes widened in shock, a flash of recognition quickly followed by what looked like shame. She instinctively tried to smooth her matted hair, to straighten her tattered coat. "Mr. Harrison," she finally managed, her voice hoarse. I didn't expect to see you again." "Nor I you," William replied, taking in the sight of the 3 children, a girl of about 10 with defiant eyes, a solemn boy who appeared to be 7, and a tiny girl no older than 4 who peeked curiously at him from behind Sarah's legs. "What happened to you?" Sarah's laugh was hollow. "Life, Mr. Harrison, a series of unfortunate events." The eldest child tugged at Sarah's sleeve, whispering something urgent. Sarah bent down to reassure her, and William caught fragments of their exchange. "What is Sapja? Just someone I used to know." "You're homeless?" William asked bluntly, his businessman's directness taking over. Sarah's chin lifted slightly, a flash of her former strength showing through her current circumstances. "We're in between situations at the moment." William glanced at his watch, a habit formed over decades of carefully scheduled days. His meeting was in 30 minutes. He should leave now, perhaps offer some cash, and continue with his day. That would be the sensible thing to do. Instead, he heard himself say, "Come with me, all of you." "Excuse me?" Sarah's disbelief was evident. "It's pouring rain, you're all soaked, I have a car right there." He gestured to the Bentley. "At the very least, let me take you somewhere dry while we figure this out." The oldest girl pulled on Sarah's arm again, her face a mask of suspicion. "We don't know him, Sarah," she said loudly enough for William to hear. "She's right to be cautious," William acknowledged, surprising himself with his patience. "But Eleanor would never forgive me if I left you here in this downpour." At the mention of Eleanor, Sarah's expression softened. She looked down at the 3 children, then back at the unrelenting rain. "Just somewhere dry to sit for a while," she conceded. "That would be very kind." The walk to the car was awkward, all 5 of them trying to fit under William's large umbrella. Once at the Bentley, the children hesitated, their small faces pressed against the window in wonder. "It's okay," Sarah assured them. "Mr. Harrison he's good people." William felt a twinge at those words. Was he? Once, perhaps, when Eleanor was alive. But these days, he wasn't sure anyone would describe William Harrison as good people. Cold, efficient, successful. These were the adjectives that followed him now. As they settled into the plush leather seats, William noticed the youngest child leaving wet fingerprints on his immaculate interior. 6 months ago, this would have infuriated him. Today, he found himself strangely unbothered. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked cautiously as he pulled away from the curb. William reached for his phone, sending a quick text to cancel his meeting, something he had never done before. "I own an apartment building on East 67th. There's a vacant unit. It's furnished." "Mr. Harrison, we couldn't possibly—" "It's sitting empty, depreciating," he said, falling back on the language of business, because it was safer than acknowledging the emotions stirring within him. "Besides, it's temporary, until you get back on your feet." As they drove through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, William caught Sarah's eye in the rearview mirror. She was silently crying, her hand covering her mouth to stifle the sound. The smallest child had fallen asleep against her shoulder, while the other two stared out the windows at the passing cityscape with wide, wary eyes. William felt something crack in his chest, a hairline fracture in the wall he had built around his heart since Eleanor's death. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to rationalize his impulsive decision. This was just charity, he told himself, the kind of tax-deductible good deed he performed regularly through his foundation. Nothing personal, nothing that would require him to feel again. But as they turned onto Park Avenue, passing the gleaming towers that housed part of his real estate empire, William couldn't help but wonder if Eleanor had somehow orchestrated this encounter from beyond. He could almost hear her whispered reminder of the promise he had made to her. "I will try to open my heart again." For the first time in 6 years, William Harrison was taking a step that wasn't mapped out in his meticulously planned life. And, despite the alarm bells ringing in his pragmatic mind, it felt strangely like coming home. The Park Avenue towers stood gleaming against the grey sky, a monument to William Harrison's business acumen. As the doorman rushed to open the car door, his eyes widened at the sight of Sarah and the children. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison," he said, struggling to maintain his professional composure. "James," William nodded curtly. "These are my guests. They'll be staying in Unit 1502. James hesitated for just a moment before responding, "Of course, sir. Shall I call ahead to have it prepared?" "That won't be necessary," William replied, guiding the small group through the marble lobby. He could feel the stares of the other residents, the whispered conversations that halted as they passed. The Harrison name commanded respect in this building. He owned it, after all, but even that couldn't prevent the raised eyebrows at the sight of their bedraggled appearance. The oldest girl, who William learned was named Lily, walked with her, shoulders back, glaring defiantly at anyone who dared to look at them too long. The middle child, a boy named Michael, kept his eyes fixed on the gleaming floor, while little Emma skipped alongside, seemingly oblivious to their surroundings, occasionally reaching out to touch the polished surfaces. "It's like a castle," Emma whispered in awe as they entered the elevator. William found himself smiling despite his discomfort. "Not quite, but it does have a nice view." The apartment on the 15th floor was one of his mid-range properties, 3 bedrooms, tastefully furnished in neutral tones, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. To William, it was merely another asset in his portfolio. To Sarah and the children, judging by their expressions, it might as well have been Buckingham Palace. "This is too much," Sarah said, standing hesitantly in the entryway. "We couldn't possibly—" "It's sitting empty," William cut her off, his tone more brusque than he intended. He softened slightly at the look on her face. "Consider it temporary accommodations while you sort things out." Lily wandered deeper into the apartment, her small hand hovering just above the surface of an expensive side table, as though afraid to leave fingerprints. "Why are you doing this?" she asked bluntly, turning to face William. "What do you want? From us?" "Lily," Sarah admonished, but William raised his hand. "It's a fair question," he acknowledged. "Your caution is sensible." He paused, searching for an answer that would satisfy the suspicious child without revealing too much of himself. Sarah took care of my wife when she was very ill. She showed kindness when we needed it most. I'm simply returning the favor." Lily's eyes narrowed, clearly unsatisfied with his response, but she said nothing more. "There should be some basic supplies in the kitchen," William continued, addressing Sarah. "I'll have my assistant arrange for a delivery of groceries and anything else you might need." "Mr. Harrison," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know how to thank you, but I also don't know if I can accept this. What happened? To me, my situation it's complicated." William checked his watch, another meeting in an hour that he couldn't miss. "Perhaps you can explain over dinner tomorrow, 7 o'clock. I'll have my chef prepare something." "You have a chef?" Emma piped up, her eyes wide. "For special occasions," William replied, surprised at his own willingness to engage with the child. After exchanging contact information and arranging the logistics, William prepared to leave. At the door he hesitated, turning back to Sarah. "What happened to you? Last I heard you were head nurse at Presbyterian." Sarah's face clouded over. "I was accused of negligence. A patient, there were complications, I was cleared eventually, but my reputation, well, no one wants to hire a nurse who's been under investigation, even if she was exonerated." William frowned. "That seems unnecessarily punitive." "The medical world is unforgiving," Sarah replied with a sad smile. "And when you add 3 kids to the equation," she gestured to the children, who were cautiously exploring their new surroundings. "They're not yours?" William asked, though he'd already surmised as much from their lack of family resemblance. Sarah's expression softened as she watched Emma pressing her face against the window, fogging the glass with her breath. "Not biologically, no. They lost their parents in the Hudson Valley flooding last year. They were going to be separated in the system." She shrugged, as though what she had done was the most natural thing in the world. "I couldn't let that happen." William felt something stir within him, respect perhaps, or admiration for her quiet heroism. It made him uncomfortable. "Tomorrow then, 7 o'clock. The next evening, William arrived precisely at 7, accompanied by his personal chef and an assistant carrying several shopping bags filled with children's clothing and toiletries. He found the apartment transformed, not in its physical co-appearance, but in its energy. Where yesterday it had been merely another sterile investment property, today it hummed with life. Michael was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, carefully constructing something out of paper, while Emma chattered away to a stuffed bear she had apparently brought with her from their previous life. Lily sat at the kitchen counter, watching Sarah wipe down surfaces that were already clean, her habitual wariness still evident. "Mr. Harrison," Sarah greeted him, looking remarkably different after a night of proper rest and a shower. Her hair, which he now noticed was a warm auburn color beneath the previous day's grime, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore clothes that must have been left in the apartment, a simple blouse and skirt that were slightly too large for her thin frame. "Please, call me William," he said, surprising himself with the invitation to familiarity. Chef Andre began setting up in the kitchen while William's assistant Jennifer explained the contents of the bags. "I took the liberty of ordering some essentials," William explained. Jennifer guessed at sizes. "This is too much," Sarah protested, but her eyes filled with tears as she examined a small pink dress clearly intended for Emma. Dinner was an awkward affair, punctuated by Emma's enthusiastic commentary and Lily's pointed silence. Michael, who had barely spoken a word since their arrival, ate methodically, his eyes darting occasionally to William with an expression that was difficult to read. "How long have you been—" William began, searching for a delicate way to phrase the question. "Homeless," Lily supplied bluntly. 3 months, 2 weeks and 4 days. Sarah placed a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. "After I lost my job, we managed for a while on my savings. Then we stayed with a friend until her landlord found out she had extra people in her apartment. After that," she trailed off, the implication clear. "And no family?" William asked. "My parents passed away years ago, no siblings." Sarah smiled sadly at the children. "Just us 4 now." As Chef Andre served dessert, a simple but elegant apple tart, Emma climbed down from her chair and approached William, her small face solemn. "Are you a prince?" she asked seriously. William blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry?" "A prince," Emma repeated. "You have a castle and servants and you rescued us from the rain. That's what princes do in stories." For the first time in what felt like years, William laughed, a genuine unguarded sound that startled even him. "No, Emma, I'm not a prince, just a businessman." "What's that?" she asked, climbing onto the chair next to him without invitation. "I build things. Buildings, mostly." Emma considered this, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Like with blocks?" "Something like that," William agreed, amused by her simplification. "I like blocks," Emma declared. "Maybe I'll be a businessman too." "Businesswoman," Sarah corrected gently. Emma nodded seriously. "A businesswoman, with blocks and a castle." William found himself charmed, despite his usual aversion to children. That sounds like an excellent plan. Later, as chef, Andre packed up his equipment, and the children were engrossed in a movie Sarah had found on the television. William stood awkwardly in the kitchen, unsure of how to take his leave. "I have a proposal," he said finally. "Stay here, all of you, until you get back on your feet. No rent, no strings attached." Sarah's expression was a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "Why would you do that? We're practically strangers." William considered deflecting with a comment about tax write-offs or charitable inclinations, but something about Sarah's direct gaze compelled honesty. "Eleanor would have wanted it," he said simply. "And perhaps I need to remember what it's like to help someone directly, not just through donations and foundations." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was as much as he was willing to admit, even to himself. The real answer was more complicated, tied to a promise made at a bedside and a hollowness that had consumed him for 6 years. Sarah studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you, William. We accept, temporarily." As William rode the elevator down to the lobby, he felt strangely light, as though some invisible burden had shifted slightly. He knew his newfound house guests would disrupt his carefully ordered life. He knew his business associates and social circle would question his judgment. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that this impulsive act of charity would unearth secrets long buried and set in motion events that would change all their lives irrevocably. 3 weeks after Sarah and the children moved into the apartment, William found himself in a situation he could never have anticipated, hosting them at the Waldorf Astoria for the annual Real Estate Developers Association Gala. The babysitter he had arranged had cancelled at the last minute with a stomach virus, leaving him with a choice: miss the event entirely, something William Harrison simply did not do, or bring his unexpected house guests along. "I can't possibly attend," Sarah protested, standing in the living room of the apartment, still wearing the simple cotton dress she'd worn all day. "I don't have anything suitable to wear, and the children already taken care of," William interrupted, gesturing to Jennifer, who was wheeling in a rack of clothing. "I had my assistant pick up some options, the children as well." "You can't just throw money at everything," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction as Emma squealed with delight, rushing to examine the colorful dresses. 2 hours later, William stood in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf, acutely aware of the whispers and stares directed their way. Sarah, stunning in a midnight blue gown that Jennifer had selected, looked elegant but uncomfortable, constantly checking on the children. Lily wore a simple black dress with obvious reluctance, while Michael tugged repeatedly at his child-sized bow tie. Only Emma seemed entirely at ease, twirling in her pink chiffon dress and charming everyone she encountered. "William, darling," cooed Vivian Wellington, the silk-voiced socialite who had been trying to secure a place in William's life and considerable fortune since Eleanor's passing. "Who are your guests?" Her perfect smile didn't reach her eyes as she assessed Sarah from head to toe. "Sarah Taylor and her children," William replied smoothly. "Sarah was Eleanor's nurse during her illness. We recently reconnected." Vivian's eyebrows rose fractionally. "How charitable of you to include them tonight. Though I must say it's a rather adult event for children, isn't it?" Before William could respond, Emma skipped up to them, her face alight with curiosity. "Your earrings look like stars," she told Vivian. "Are they real diamonds?" "Mr. William has a safe full of diamonds in his office. He showed me when I asked where stars go during the day." William suppressed a smile at Vivian's shocked expression. He had indeed shown Emma his office, though the safe full of diamonds was merely a single case containing Eleanor's jewelry, pieces he couldn't bear to part with but never displayed. "Emma," Sarah called, hurrying over. "I'm so sorry if she's bothering you." "Not at all," William assured her, placing a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma was just admiring Vivian's jewelry." "Well," Vivian said stiffly, "children do say the most imaginative things, don't they?" She excused herself with a thin smile, disappearing into the crowd. "I've made a mess of things," Sarah whispered anxiously. "People are staring. This was a mistake." "On the contrary," William replied, watching Emma fearlessly approach the mayor of New York with the same open curiosity. "I think this evening just got considerably more interesting." And it had. For years, William had attended these functions out of obligation, mechanically shaking hands and making the right connections while feeling nothing. Tonight, seeing the event through the children's eyes, Emma's. Wonder, Michael's quiet observation, even Lily's suspicious assessment, he found himself noticing details long overlooked: the artificial laughter, the jockeying for position, the barely concealed rivalries beneath polite veneers. During dinner, Emma was seated between William and a prominent city council member, who had always intimidated William's peers with his brusque manner. To everyone's surprise, the typically stern politician melted under Emma's artless questioning. "Why do you have white hair if you're not Santa?" she asked him, wide-eyed. The entire table froze, but then the councilman let out a booming laugh, the first time many had ever seen him do so at these events. "Age and wisdom, young lady, age and wisdom." "Mr. William is wise too, but his hair is still brown mostly," Emma observed thoughtfully. "Is he now?" the councilman asked, his eyes twinkling as he glanced at William. "And what wisdom has Mr. William shared with you?" Emma considered this seriously. "He showed me how to fold a napkin into a swan, and he said that buildings are just boxes with dreams inside." William nearly choked on his drink. He had indeed said something like that, during a moment of rare nostalgia when Emma had asked about his work. It was the kind of poetic nonsense Eleanor would have appreciated, something the pragmatic businessman he'd become rarely articulated. As the evening progressed, William found himself repeatedly drawn into conversations with Sarah, surprised by her insightful observations about the guests and the social dynamics at play. Her experience as a nurse had clearly honed her ability to read people. "That man," she murmured, nodding discreetly toward a developer William had been trying to partner with for months. "He keeps clenching his left hand. When your competitor approaches, there's tension there." William filed the information away, impressed. "You'd make a good negotiator." Sarah smiled wryly. "When you've had to tell family members their loved ones aren't going to recover, you learn to read the room." The comment, delivered casually, reminded William sharply of Eleanor's final days, of Sarah's compassionate presence, her steady hand as she administered pain medication, her quiet efficiency in making his wife comfortable when nothing else could be done. Something must have shown on his face because Sarah's expression softened. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned—" "No," William interrupted. It's fine. Eleanor's illness isn't a forbidden topic." Though in truth it had been, at least in his mind, for 6 years. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the dessert table. Michael, who had barely spoken all evening, was standing rigidly beside a shattered crystal bowl, chocolate mousse splattered across the pristine white tablecloth. "The clumsy little brat did it on purpose," a red-faced man was saying loudly. William recognized him as Theodore Blackwell, a notoriously difficult colleague from a rival firm. William was across the room in moments, placing himself between Theodore and the frozen Michael. "It was an accident, I'm sure," he said firmly. "These charity cases you've taken in have no place at an event like this," Theodore hissed, low enough that only William could hear. "First your bleeding heart wife with her endless foundations, and now you're housing street urchins. Have you completely lost your business sense, Harrison?" William felt a surge of rage unlike anything he'd experienced in years. "You will apologize to the boy," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I will do no such—" "You will apologize," William repeated. or I will personally ensure that your bid for the Riverside project fails spectacularly. I believe I still hold considerable influence with the zoning board." Theodore's face paled. The Riverside development was crucial to his company's financial stability, as William well knew. After a tense moment, he turned to Michael with a forced smile. "Sorry for the misunderstanding, young man. Accidents happen." Michael, still rigid with fear, gave a barely perceptible nod. Later that night, as their car pulled away from the Waldorf, Lily broke her usual silence. "You threatened that." "Man for Michael." It wasn't a question, and William wasn't sure how to respond. He hadn't meant for the children to overhear the exchange. "Mr. Blackwell was out of line," he said finally. "But you were scary," Lily persisted. "Like, really scary." William frowned, uncomfortable with the observation. "I think," Sarah said, carefully from beside him, "what Mr. Harrison demonstrated was that sometimes strength can be used to protect others." "Like a knight," Emma chimed in sleepily, her head lolling against Sarah's shoulder. "Mr. William is our knight." The simple proclamation hung in the air between them, both heartwarming and terrifying in its implication. William had been many things in his life: a shrewd businessman, a reluctant socialite, a grieving widower, but never someone's protector, not since Eleanor. The following morning, William was summoned to an emergency meeting of the Park Avenue Towers Co-op Board. He owned the building, but as part of his strategy to attract elite tenants, he had established a homeowners association with limited powers to maintain the building's prestigious character. "This is highly irregular, Harrison," said Richard Montgomery, a retired judge who served as the board's president. "Housing homeless individuals in one of the city's most exclusive addresses? There are concerns about security, about property values." "They are my guests," William replied coldly, "in an apartment that I own, in a building that I own." "Nevertheless," chimed in Vanessa Sinclair, a plastic surgeon's wife known for her social climbing, "there are standards to maintain. Just yesterday, I saw the little girl, the smallest one, playing in the lobby. Playing, William, as if it were a public playground." "The horror?" William deadpanned, surprising himself with the sarcasm that was so reminiscent of Eleanor's wit. "This isn't a joke," Richard insisted. "Several residents have expressed concern." "About what, exactly?" William interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "That a child's laughter might disrupt the mausoleum-like atmosphere we've cultivated? That a homeless woman given a second chance might somehow devalue your multi-million-dollar investments? The investments, I might add, that I've personally insured have appreciated by 15% in the last fiscal year alone." "It's not personal, William," Vanessa began. "Isn't it?" William stood, towering over the seated board members. "Let me make something perfectly clear. Sarah Taylor saved my wife's life on multiple occasions during her illness. She gave Eleanor and me precious additional months together through her exceptional care. Months that I squandered working late nights on development projects that seem utterly meaningless in retrospect." The room fell silent, the board members exchanging uncomfortable glances. William rarely spoke of Eleanor, and never with such raw emotion. "Sarah and those children will stay in my apartment for as long as they need to," he continued, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt. "And if anyone makes them feel unwelcome, I will personally ensure that their own tenancy becomes untenable." With that, William strode from the room, his heart pounding. He had never defended anyone so fiercely, not even himself. The feeling was foreign, uncomfortable, and strangely exhilarating. As he waited for the elevator, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Found something strange. Need to talk when you have time." Intrigued and still riding the wave of adrenaline from the confrontation, William replied immediately, "On my way up now." When he entered the apartment, he found Sarah sitting at the dining table, a photograph in one hand and a small object in the other. The children were nowhere to be seen. "They're at the park with the nanny you hired," Sarah explained, answering his unasked question. "I needed to show you this without them around." She placed the photograph on the table, a picture of Eleanor that had been stored in the apartment's closet, wearing an elegant evening gown and a distinctive sapphire butterfly brooch that had Been William's last anniversary gift to her before her diagnosis. Next to the photograph, Sarah placed a small tarnished pendant in the shape of a butterfly, its blue stones matching the brooch exactly. Michael has kept this hidden since I've known him, Sarah said quietly. He says it belonged to his mother. William, what are the chances that this exact design— William stared at the two pieces of jewelry, identical in every detail except size. Almost none, he replied, his mind racing with implications. Unless there's a connection we don't know about, Sarah finished for him. William picked up the pendant carefully, turning it over. On the back was a tiny engraving. To my dearest sister, love always, E. E for Eleanor. He looked up at Sarah, his world shifting beneath his feet. I need to make some calls. William sat in his office at Harrison Developments, staring at the preliminary report from the private investigator he had hired. The connection was even more direct than he had imagined. Michael's mother, Catherine Wells, had been Eleanor's distant cousin. They had lost touch years ago before William had even met Eleanor, but the family connection was unmistakable. More troubling, however, was what the investigation had uncovered about Sarah's professional disgrace. The patient whose complications had led to the negligence accusation had been under the care of Dr. James Whitmore, chief of cardiology at New York Presbyterian, and, more relevantly, William's longtime friend and occasional business partner. It was James who had signed off on the report, blaming Sarah, despite evidence that now suggested the complications arose from his own misdiagnosis. William's desk phone buzzed. Mr. Harrison, Dr. Whitmore is here to see you. Send him in, William replied, closing the folder. He had asked James to meet him, though he hadn't specified why. Dr. Whitmore entered with the confident stride of a man accustomed to respect, his silver hair and tailored suit projecting success and authority. At 65, he was still considered one of the top cardiologists in the country. William, good to see you, he said warmly, taking a seat across from the desk. Your assistant was rather cryptic about the reason for this meeting. Is everything all right? Your heart giving you trouble again? William had experienced minor arrhythmia years ago, which was how he had first met James professionally before they became friends. My heart is fine, William replied carefully. I wanted to ask you about a former nurse, Sarah Taylor. The change in James's expression was subtle but unmistakable, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible straightening of his posture. Taylor? The name doesn't ring a bell. Was she part of my team at some point? The lie was so smooth that if William hadn't been looking for it, he might have missed it. She was Eleanor's primary nurse during her final months, and yes, she was part of your cardiology team for several years. Ah, James said with practiced casualness. Now I remember. There was some issue with her care of a patient, wasn't there? Had to let her go, if I recall correctly. She was exonerated, William said quietly. James waved a dismissive hand. Technically perhaps, but in medicine, even the suggestion of negligence can be damaging. Better for all involved that she moved on. Moved on, William repeated, his voice hardening. She became homeless, James. She and 3 orphan children she took in. For the first time, James appeared genuinely startled. I had no idea her circumstances became so dire. That's unfortunate. Unfortunate, William echoed, feeling his anger rise. I've recently taken them in, provided them housing in one of my properties. Have you now? James's surprise shifted to calculation. That's very charitable of you, William, though I must say it's rather out of character. You've always preferred your philanthropy to be conducted through foundations and at arm's length. People change, William said simply. Indeed, James studied him carefully. May I ask why you're bringing this up now? It's been, 3 years since the Taylor incident? I've been reviewing her case, William replied, watching James's reaction closely. There are some inconsistencies that trouble me. Ancient history, surely, James said with forced lightness. The hospital's review board made their determination. Even if there were grey areas, Reopening old wounds serves no purpose. It serves the purpose of justice, William countered, and reputation. Sarah's reputation was destroyed while yours remained intact, even flourished. I find that curious. James's expression hardened. What exactly are you implying, William? I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. William opened the folder before him. Patient Bernard Keller, admitted with symptoms suggesting angina. You diagnosed him with mild coronary artery disease, prescribed standard medication. Sarah noted discrepancies in his EKG that suggested something more serious. Her notes, which mysteriously disappeared from the official record, recommended additional tests. Tests that you deemed unnecessary. This is absurd, James scoffed. You're a real estate developer, not a cardiologist. You can't possibly understand the nuances of... I understand enough, William interrupted. Keller suffered a massive heart attack while under hospital care. You were unavailable at a fundraising gala, if I recall, where you and I shared a table. Sarah made emergency decisions that saved his life, but he experienced complications. Complications that, according to 3 independent experts I've consulted, resulted from the advanced state of his condition, a condition that might have been properly treated had you listened to Sarah's concerns initially. James stood abruptly. I don't have to listen to this amateur analysis. The hospital review board was chaired by your brother-in-law, William finished calmly. Another interesting fact. The color drained from James's face. What do you want, William? The truth. A public acknowledgement of Sarah's correct assessment. A formal retraction of the negligence accusations. That would ruin me, James whispered. It would correct an injustice, William countered, and perhaps save future patients from similar oversights. James paced the office, running a hand through his silver hair. You don't understand the pressures of my position, the hundreds of decisions made daily, the impossible standards. I understand taking responsibility for mistakes, William said, something I've had to learn the hard way recently. Why do you even care? James demanded. This woman was just your wife's nurse, unless... His eyes narrowed. Are you involved with her romantically? Is that it? The suggestion caught William off guard. My relationship with Sarah is not the issue here. But there is a relationship, James pressed, seizing on William's careful phrasing. William sighed, suddenly weary of the verbal sparring. They deserve justice, James. Not just Sarah, but those children. Children? What children have to do with a medical review from 3 years ago? William hesitated, then made a decision. He reached into his desk drawer and removed the small butterfly pendant, placing it on the desk between them. One of the children in Sarah's care is wearing this. It belonged to his mother, Catherine Wells. James stared at the pendant, uncomprehending. And? Catherine was Eleanor's cousin. William turned over the pendant, revealing the engraving. This was a gift from Eleanor to Catherine years ago, before I met either of them, a family heirloom redesigned as matching pieces. I'm sorry, William, but I fail to see how a family trinket connects to Sarah Taylor's professional situation. It doesn't, William admitted, but it's made me realize how interconnected our lives can be without our knowledge, how decisions we make, or avoid making, ripple outward to affect others in ways we can't imagine. He leaned forward. I'm not asking this for Sarah's sake alone. I'm asking for yours, James. Mine, James laughed bitterly. The burden of this lie has affected your work. 3 of your recent cases have had complications similar to Keller's, misdiagnoses, ignored warnings from nursing staff. Your reputation is still intact, but for how long? How many more mistakes before someone else connects the dots? James sank back into his chair, his arrogance deflating visibly. How do you know all this? I've been thorough, William said simply. Eleanor always said I was relentless when pursuing a goal. The mention of Eleanor seemed to affect James deeply. He had been her doctor too before her illness progressed beyond his specialty. She was a remarkable woman, he said quietly. She deserved better than she got. From both of us. William felt the familiar pang of guilt that accompanied any discussion of Eleanor's final years. Yes, she did. After a long silence, James spoke, his voice subdued. What would this correction Involve, exactly. A formal letter to the medical board, acknowledging your error in the Keller case and Sarah's correct assessment. A similar letter to Presbyterian, clearing her name and professional record. And then? Then we're done. Your recent cases remain between us unless I see evidence of continued negligence. James studied him. This isn't like you, William. The William Harrison I've known for 20 years would never involve himself in someone else's professional dispute, especially not a former employee's. Perhaps you didn't know me as well as you thought, William replied. Or perhaps I'm changing. After James left, promising to draft the letters by the end of the week, William sat alone in his office contemplating the butterfly pendant still lying on his desk. Eleanor had never mentioned her cousin Catherine, or if she had, he had been too absorbed in work to remember. How many other connections, other relationships, had he overlooked or forgotten in his single-minded pursuit of business success? His thoughts were interrupted by his phone buzzing with a text from Sarah. "Emergency. Please come to the apartment right away." William's heart raced as he rushed from his office, imagining countless disasters. When he arrived at the apartment, 20 minutes later, he found Sarah pacing anxiously in the living room. "What's happened? Are the children all right?" he demanded. "Physically, yes," Sarah said, her face drawn with worry. "But Michael, he had some kind of panic attack at school. His teacher called me. Apparently they were discussing family trees in class, and when asked about his parents, he became hysterical." William felt a wave of relief that quickly transformed into concern. "Where is he now?" "In his room. He won't speak to me or the girls. He's just sitting on his bed, holding that butterfly pendant and staring at the wall." William hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Comforting a traumatized child was far outside his expertise. Perhaps a professional... "I've called a child psychologist," Sarah assured him. "She can see him tomorrow, but I thought maybe you could try talking to him. About Eleanor, about the connection. He might respond to that." "Me?" William was genuinely perplexed. "Sarah, I'm hardly the most comforting presence. The boy barely speaks when I'm around." "He watches you," Sarah said. "All the time, haven't you noticed? He follows your movements, studies your expressions. I think he's looking for himself in you, for a model of how a man handles grief." The observation struck William deeply. He hadn't noticed Michael's attention, too wrapped up in his own discomfort around children to see the boy's silent observation. With reluctance born of uncertainty rather than unwillingness, William approached Michael's room. He knocked softly on the door before entering. Michael sat cross-legged on his bed, just as Sarah had described, the butterfly pendant clutched tightly in his small hand. His face was tear-streaked but dry now, his expression remote. "May I come?" "Tonight?" William asked formally. Michael nodded almost imperceptibly. William sat awkwardly on the edge of the bed, maintaining what he hoped was a respectful distance. "Sarah told me what happened at school today." No response. "I understand that talking about parents can be difficult when you've lost them," William continued, feeling his way uncertainly. "When I lost Eleanor, my wife, I didn't want to talk. About her either. It hurt too much." Michael's eyes flickered to him briefly, then back to the pendant. "That was your mother's, wasn't it?" William gestured to the butterfly. "It's very special." "Mom said it was magic." Michael spoke for the first time, his voice barely audible. "She said as long as I had it, I would always be connected to her. But it's not true. She's gone, and I can't remember her face anymore." The raw honesty of the child's pain cut through William's usual defenses. "I understand that too," he said quietly. "I've kept Eleanor's things exactly as they were, but sometimes I still struggle to remember the exact sound of her laugh." Michael looked up, his eyes wide with surprise at this admission. "But I learned something recently," William continued. "Your mother and my wife were cousins, family. They both had one of these butterflies." He pointed to the pendant. "Eleanor's was a brooch, a pin, but the same design." "Really?" Michael's voice was small but tinged with wonder. "Really?" William confirmed. "Which means, in a way, we're connected too." "Like family?" Michael asked hesitantly. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications William hadn't considered until this moment. "Like family," he agreed, the words feeling strangely right. Michael's rigid posture relaxed slightly. "Do you have pictures of your wife, my cousin?" "I do," William said, surprising himself with his willingness to share this most private part of his life. "Would you like to see them?" Michael nodded, and for the first time since William had known him, the boy's face showed a flicker of hope. Later that evening, Sarah found them in William's study, surrounded by photo albums William had brought from his penthouse. Michael was animated in a way she had never seen, asking questions about Eleanor, about the places in the photographs, about the butterfly brooch that appeared in many images. "She liked butterflies because they change," William was explaining, pointing to a picture of Eleanor in a butterfly garden. "She said people could transform too if they were brave enough." "Like how?" Michael asked. William considered the question seriously. "Like someone who's always been focused on business learning to care about people again, or someone who's lost everything finding the courage to build a new life." His eyes met Sarah's over Michael's head, and an understanding passed between them, a recognition of the changes already taking place in both their lives, catalyzed by an unexpected encounter on a rainy spring afternoon. That night, as William prepared to leave for his own apartment, Sarah walked him to the door. "Thank you," she said simply, "for what you did for Michael today, and for what you're doing about my professional situation." William looked at her in surprise. "How did you know about that?" "Dr. Whitmore's office called to verify my contact information for an official correspondence," Sarah explained. His assistant was quite confused about the whole thing. William had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I should have consulted you first." "Yes, you should have," Sarah agreed, but there was no anger in her voice. "It's a pattern with you, isn't it? Making unilateral decisions that affect other people's lives, first taking us in, now clearing my name." "I'm not very good at collaboration," William admitted. "No," Sarah said with a small smile, "but you're learning." As William rode the elevator down to the lobby, he reflected on her words. He was learning, slowly and awkwardly, to consider, others to see beyond his own walled garden of grief and work. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. His phone buzzed with a notification, a calendar reminder for the next day's board meeting to review the downtown development project. Once that meeting would have been the center of his universe. Now it seemed secondary to the complex human drama unfolding in apartment 1502. William smiled to himself, imagining Eleanor's reaction to his shifting priorities. "About time," she would have said with that gentle, teasing smile he missed every day. About time. 6 months after that rainy spring afternoon, the Harrison penthouse was transformed. Where once stark minimalism and carefully curated artwork had created an atmosphere of elegant restraint, now colorful drawings adorned the refrigerator. A worn, stuffed bear occupied a place of honor on the living room sofa, and a collection of small shoes cluttered the entryway. William stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, watching the autumn leaves swirl in the late October breeze. Behind him, the sounds of children's laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long. "Mr. William, look what I made!" Emma bounded into the room, holding a paper construction that vaguely resembled a building. At 4.5 years old, her artistic skills were enthusiastic rather than precise. William turned from the window, crouching down to examine her creation with appropriate seriousness. "Is this a castle?" he guessed, recalling her ongoing fascination with royal residences. Emma shook her head emphatically, her dark curls bouncing. "No, silly, it's your new building, the one for the sick children." William smiled, genuinely touched by her interpretation of the pediatric medical center he was developing, the project that had emerged from his confrontation with James Whitmore months earlier. Rather than merely clearing Sarah's name, William had channeled his indignation into action, establishing a foundation to improve patient care through better communication between doctors and nursing staff. "It's perfect," he told Emma solemnly. "In fact, I think I should show this to my architects. They could learn something from your design." Emma beamed with pride before skipping back toward the kitchen, where Sarah was preparing dinner with Lily's increasingly competent help. The transformation in the eldest child had been the most remarkable, from suspicious hostility to cautious trust, and finally to a quiet confidence that grew stronger each day. Michael appeared in the doorway, a book tucked under his arm. "Mr. William, can we continue our chess game before dinner?" The formal address remained, despite William's gentle suggestions that the children might call him by his first name alone. It had become something of an affectionate title rather than a mark of distance. Mr. William was how he was known, in this new family constellation that had formed around him. "Certainly," William replied, moving toward the chess set permanently established in one corner of the living room. Michael had shown a natural aptitude for the game, his methodical mind quickly grasping strategies that William had carefully taught him over the past months. As they settled into their chairs, William studied the boy's face. Calmer now, more open than it had been 6 months ago, though still serious beyond his years. Michael caught him looking and offered a small smile, another sign of his growing comfort. "Your move first," William reminded him. "And remember what we discussed about controlling the center." "I remember everything you tell me," Michael said, matter-of-factly, moving his pawn with careful deliberation. The simple statement warmed William unexpectedly. It was true. Michael absorbed every bit of knowledge William shared, from chess strategies to business concepts to historical trivia. The boy's mind was a sponge, eager for the guidance and information that William, somewhat to his own surprise, found himself uniquely positioned to provide. Their game proceeded in comfortable silence until Sarah called them to dinner. The dining, a table, once used primarily for contract signings and the occasional solitary meal, was now set for 5 every night, with proper place settings that Sarah had insisted upon as part of the children's education. "Guess what?" Lily announced as they settled into their chairs. "I got the highest math score in my class today. Ms. Peterson said I have a natural analytical mind." "That's wonderful," Sarah praised, serving portions of chicken and vegetables to each plate. "Not surprising," William added. "You approach problems very systematically. That's a valuable skill." Lily tried to hide her pleasure at his praise, but her small smile gave her away. Of all the children, she remained the most guarded with William, though the open hostility had long since faded. "Sarah got a call today," Lily continued, sending a significant look toward the woman who had become her surrogate mother. "From that hospital in Boston." William's heart sank. The prestigious Boston Children's Hospital had been recruiting Sarah for weeks, impressed by her credentials, now fully restored thanks to Dr. Whitmore's formal retraction and her specialized experience with pediatric care. "Oh?" he managed, striving for a neutral tone. "What did they have to say?" Sarah looked uncomfortable. "They've increased their offer. Chief Nursing Officer for the entire pediatric cardiology department." "That's quite an opportunity," William said carefully. "It's in Boston," Emma pointed out with a frown. "That's far away." 3 hours and 27 minutes by car, Michael supplied, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. 215 miles. The precision of his knowledge revealed that he had researched this possibility extensively, another sign of the anxiety that still occasionally surfaced when change threatened the stability the children had found. "I haven't made any decisions," Sarah assured them all, her eyes meeting William's briefly before focusing on her plate. "It's just something to consider." The conversation shifted to safer topics, but a new tension lingered in the air. After dinner, when the children were occupied with homework and their evening routines, William found Sarah alone in the kitchen, methodically loading the dishwasher. "Boston would be a remarkable opportunity for you," he said without preamble. Sarah closed the dishwasher with a quiet click before turning to face him. "Yes, it would." "The children would adjust," William continued, though the words felt hollow even to himself. "Good schools there, cultural opportunities." "William," Sarah said gently, "are you trying to convince me to take the job or yourself to be okay with it?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. After months of gradually growing closer, of shared responsibilities and quiet evening conversations after the children were asleep, Sarah had developed an unsettling ability to see through his carefully constructed facades. Both, perhaps, he admitted. I want what's best for you, for all of you. And what about what's best for you? Sarah asked, taking a step closer. William found himself unable to meet her gaze. I've spent most of my adult life focusing exclusively on what I thought was best for me. It's led to considerable financial success and personal isolation. Perhaps it's time to prioritize others. That's not what Eleanor would have wanted, Sarah said quietly. The mention of his late wife startled him, though they had spoken of her more freely in recent months, particularly with Michael. Sarah rarely invoked Eleanor's memory in their private conversations. What do you mean? She talked about you, you know, Sarah said, leaning against the counter. During those long nights in the hospital when the pain kept her awake, she worried about you, about what would happen to you after she was gone. William felt a familiar constriction in his chest. I didn't know. She made me promise something the night before she passed. Sarah's voice was soft with the weight of memory. She said, don't let him disappear into his work. Remind him there's more to life. You never told me this, William said, stunned by the revelation. I tried, Sarah replied with a sad smile. I called your office several times in the months after. Your assistant always said you were unavailable. The implications of this missed connection, of Sarah reaching out years ago only to be deflected by the barriers he had erected around himself, left William momentarily speechless. I gave up eventually, Sarah continued. Moved on with my life until everything fell apart. And then years later, there you were at that red light in the rain. Coincidence, William murmured, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged. Or maybe Eleanor had a hand in it somehow. She was quite determined when she set her mind to something. Her eyes twinkled with fond remembrance. Rather like someone else I know. William felt a smile tug at his lips, despite the emotional weight of the conversation. She was the determined one in our relationship. I was merely stubborn. A fine distinction, Sarah teased gently. Their eyes met, and William felt the familiar warmth that had been growing between them for months, a connection that had developed so gradually he could hardly pinpoint, when respect and gratitude had evolved into something deeper. I don't want you to go to Boston, he said suddenly, the words escaping before he could filter them through his usual careful consideration. The children either. I know it's selfish, and I know I have no right to ask you to turn down such an opportunity. But the thought of this place without all of you in it, he gestured to the kitchen around them, to the home they had created together. Sarah studied him for a long moment. Ask me to stay, she said simply. I just did. She shook her head. No, ask us to stay, properly. Not as your house guests or as recipients of your charity or even as friends. Ask us to stay as family. The word hung in. The air between them, family, with all its implications and complications and promises. William thought of Eleanor, of the promise he had made her to open his heart again. He thought of Michael, Lily, and Emma, each healing and growing in their own way under his roof. And he thought of Sarah, who had brought life and purpose back into his carefully ordered existence. Stay, he said quietly, reaching for her hand. All of you, as family. My family. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. Are you sure? We come with considerable complications, you know. I've never been more certain of anything, William replied, squeezing her hand. Though I should warn you that I'm still learning how to be part of a family. I may require considerable patience. Fortunately, Sarah said, stepping closer, patience is one of my professional specialties. Their moment was interrupted by a small voice from the doorway. Are you and Mr. William going to get married? They turned to find Emma watching. Then with curious eyes, her stuffed bear clutched in one arm. Sarah laughed, her cheeks flushing. Emma, that's a very direct question. But are you? Emma persisted. Because Michael says we might have to move to Boston, but I don't want to leave Mr. William, and if you get married, then we can all stay here forever and ever. William crouched down to Emma's level, a position that had become increasingly natural to him over the months. Emma, these things take time. Grown-ups need to... Do you love Sarah? Emma interrupted, her expression serious. William glanced. up at Sarah, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. 6 months ago, he would have deflected such a direct emotional question, especially from a child, but he was no longer the same man who had spotted a familiar face in the rain that spring day. "Yes," he said simply. "I do." Emma nodded, satisfied. "And you love us too, so we should be a real family." The straightforward logic of childhood cutting through complications to the essential truth. "Out of the mouths of babes," Sarah murmured, placing a hand on William's shoulder. "Miss Sarah, Mr. William," Michael's urgent voice called from the living room. "Come quick, there's something wrong with the TV." They hurried into the living room, where Michael and Lily stood staring at the massive screen that was displaying only static. "Breaking news," the announcer's voice cut through the interference. "We're receiving reports of significant structural damage at Harrison Tower following this afternoon's unexpected tremors." William felt his heart drop. Harrison Tower was his newest development, a 30-story glass and steel structure in Midtown that had opened just 3 months earlier. He reached for the remote, increasing the volume as the picture stabilized to show emergency vehicles surrounding the base of the building. Preliminary reports indicate that while no serious injuries have occurred, engineering experts are concerned about potential additional collapse in the East Wing. Authorities have evacuated the building and surrounding area as a precaution. "Your building," Sarah said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "Oh, William." William barely heard her, his mind racing through implications, structural assessments, insurance claims, potential lawsuits, media management. Instinctively, he reached for his phone, ready to dive into crisis management mode. But as his fingers closed around the device, he became aware of 3 small faces watching him with various expressions of concern. Michael's solemn worry, Lily's analytical assessment, Emma's open fear. "Is your special building broken?" Emma asked in a small voice. William took a deep breath, set his phone down, and gathered Emma into his arms. "Parts of it, sweetheart, but buildings can be fixed." "Are you going to go there now?" Michael asked, his voice carefully neutral, though his eyes betrayed his anxiety about disruption to their newfound stability. 6 months ago, even 3 months ago, William wouldn't have hesitated. He would have been in his car within minutes, personally taking control of the situation, working through the night if necessary. Now he looked at the family gathered around him, his family, and made a different choice. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere tonight. I have excellent people who can handle the immediate situation. Tomorrow will be soon enough for me to assess things personally." The relief on their faces was immediate and profound. Lily, in a rare display of physical affection, leaned against his side. "Can we finish our movie then?" "Absolutely," William agreed, settling onto the sofa with Emma still in his arms and the others arranging themselves around him. As the movie resumed, some animated feature about talking animals that William had seen so many times, he could recite portions from memory. His phone buzzed repeatedly with incoming messages. They went unanswered as William made a conscious choice to remain fully present with the people who had become the center of his world. Later that night, after the children were asleep, William stood again at the windows of his penthouse, gazing out at the city lights. Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his. "You're worried about the building," she observed. "Yes," he acknowledged, "but it's insured, and no one was hurt. It's just steel and glass." Sarah studied his profile in the dim light. "That's not something the William Harrison I met 6 months ago would have said." "No," he agreed. "That William was more concerned with structures than the people inside them." "And now?" William turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Now I understand what Eleanor meant about learning to open my heart again. She wasn't talking about finding someone new to love, though I'm profoundly grateful that's happened." He squeezed Sarah's hands gently. "She was talking about remembering what matters, about building a life, not just a portfolio. She would be proud of you," Sarah said softly, "of how far you've come." "I hope so," William replied. "I used to think keeping her memory alive meant keeping everything exactly as it was when she was here. Now I realize that honoring her means living fully as she would have wanted me to do." Outside, the autumn wind gusted, sending another shower of leaves swirling past the windows. Inside, in the warmth of the home they had created together, William Harrison, builder of skyscrapers and now, more importantly, builder of a family, held tightly to the hands of the woman who had helped him find his way back to himself. "Stay," he whispered again. "Not just for now, but for always." Sarah's answer was in her eyes, bright with unshed tears and in the soft pressure of her lips against his. A promise of tomorrows stretching out before them, filled with the joyful chaos of family life and the quiet certainty of having found, against all odds, a second chance at happiness. In Eleanor's old study, now transformed into a colorful playroom, a framed photograph stood on the bookshelf, showing a smiling woman wearing a sapphire butterfly brooch. Next to it, in a new frame, was a family portrait taken the previous month at Central Park. William, Sarah, and 3 children with matching expressions of cautious hope. And on a delicate chain around Michael's neck, a small butterfly pendant caught the light, its sapphire wings linking past to present. Lost to renewal, endings to new beginnings, a circle completed in the most unexpected and beautiful way.